Okay, with that, I'll probably just get right into it. A lot of ground to cover. So, pardon me. So, first and foremost, for a lot of people are the grasshopper populations, and we can see from 2022 grasshopper survey to the 2023 grasshopper survey a relatively marked increase in the numbers of grasshoppers that were detected. An important consideration is that these animals are sampled in August, and of course, if there are not host plants for these animals, particularly in areas where they may have been prevalent or present in large numbers earlier in the season, they may not have been detected. So we have had some feedback regarding the particularly the 2023 grasshoppers that some were not detected in areas where they were prevalent early season. So they are highly mobile, and I'll talk about that. So if there aren't viable host plants there, another thing to consider is that populations can be highly aggregated as well. So it is possible to miss populations that are there. I suspect, however, that if the ditches are cut and the crops are harvested by the time the survey occurs, they may have simply moved on. With that, a little bit of discussion about some of the pest grasshoppers. We've got four species that are the primary pests in Saskatchewan, and we'll talk about these in relative order of importance. So our most prevalent pest throughout the province right now is two-striped grasshopper. This one again is the prevalent pest, although we have some other species that are more important locally. All of the pest species overwinter as eggs. And this can be important for their survival over the course of the winter. Their eggs start to hatch about 8 to 10 days ahead of migratory grasshopper, which is the second most important pest in the province currently. They're going to concentrate their eggs in roadsides and ditches. They seem to like, along with some other grasshopper species, having that tight thatch to lay their eggs into. Um, so that could influence control decisions as they move in from ditches. These ones typically prefer lush habitats and heavy textured soils. They've got a relatively broad host range, but as a rule tend to prefer broadleaf plants or more lush foliage. They can be pests of alfalfa and other crops. However, they will feed on cereals and they can engage in migratory behavior. One thing that's really characteristic about these animals, and you can see that with all of the nymphal stages, is that black stripe on the hind femur. So if you see that, I don't want to say you're guaranteed to be looking at two-stripe, but your odds of looking at two-stripe grasshopper are greatly increased. You can also see the characteristic two stripes, hence two-stripe grasshopper, extending from between the eyes all the way along the tops of those forewings as they're folded. So relatively conspicuous characteristics. These animals are also big. So about an inch and a half for adult females, and that's a pretty hefty grasshopper. The next one is migratory grasshopper. Some characteristic features of these, although you can see a number of different color morphs of these and all of the species that we'll talk about. However, this characteristic striping on the hind femur, you can see illustrated there, quite distinct, commonly have red tibia on their hind legs, although this can be variable as well. And you can see that mottled coloration on the forewing, on that little stripe there, relatively characteristic of these animals. They tend to they overwinter as eggs, like the rest of the pest species that we'll be discussing today. So groups 1824 eggs laid in soil late summer. They get them relatively deep into the soil, especially for a relatively small grasshopper. So typically about an inch for adult females on these ones. They start to hatch in May, and as I indicated before, two-striped is going to start hatching a little bit earlier. And two-striped started hatching really early in 2023, almost 2 weeks early in some parts of the province, primarily the southwest. There are 5 nymphal instars, and under ideal conditions, they'll get through that development from hatch to adulthood in just over a month. So ideal conditions, dry and warm. They also have a very broad host range, and they have been described as garbage guts. So that is, if it's green and it's not nailed down, they'll at least give it a go. They have a very broad host range. They will also scavenge on ground litter, and they're not unique to feeding on dead insects. Other grasshopper species will do that, including engaging in cannibalism of their dead pals. And in the case of migratory, they will also feed on dry manure. So Packard's grasshopper, this historically was the second most important in previous outbreaks. It's become a distant third in this most recent grasshopper outbreak. Regionally important in relatively small populations, but for the most part, their populations are nowhere near what we're seeing for two-striped grasshopper and migratory grasshopper. Once again, overwinter as eggs, hatching May, June, 5 nymphal instars. Really characteristic about these ones, and although there can be some variations on this theme, is that bright green nymphal stage. You know, you see the fourth instar, third instar, fifth, without that black stripe on the hind femur. So that's a pretty clear indication that you're probably looking at Packard's grasshopper. You can see this one also has two light stripes, but it's only on the pronotum. So it stops when the wings start. So right behind the head, just on that shield, right behind the head. Typically, you're going to see greater pressures in the northern range. They also have a relatively broad host range, but one of their favorite host plants or group of host plants are thistles. However, they can be damaging to crop plants as well. And this will be the last pest species that we talk about in detail. This is the clearwing grasshopper. Uh, they're going to be one of the later ones to come up. Their nymphs are going to be produced, a couple of weeks after migratory grasshopper come up. Why these ones are relatively important is that they are grass specialists. So that is, they really like cereals. And you can see, much like the other species that we've discussed, their range extends over a broad extent to North America. So in the southern portion of their range, they can engage in migratory behavior and are actually called the California migratory locust. Um, so relatively conspicuous features of this animal, relatively small size, a little bit smaller than the migratory grasshopper, so about in that inch range for females. Females are larger than males, and that camouflage pattern on the forewing. You can see folded over there, very distinctive. You can see that there are stripes on this animal's wings as well, not as broad as you would see with two-stripe, and of course, two-striped is a much larger grasshopper. Also, those carinae are really characteristic. So that is that keel on the pronotum there. You got to get pretty close up to these animals to be able to detect that. Neonates are very conspicuous with that black and white zebra striping. Or so first instar is the new hatchlings. And once again, primarily a grass feeder. So if you see this animal in other crops, that should inform your control decisions, because they won't have interest in other crops other than cereals. So they could just be there basking, sunning, getting their internal temperatures up. So we do have some non-pest species as well. So an important consideration, we have about 85 species of grasshoppers in Western Canada. Most of these are completely harmless to agriculture. Of course, the four that I discussed are numerous enough where they can be a real problem. So we do get a lot of reports about road dusters or Carolina grasshopper late last season. This is one, this is a big animal, inch and a half plus long, heavy, noisy flyer with those brightly colored hind wings. That's pictured top right, and the next photo down. The one that's right below that is called a Carolina. It's called a speckled wing rangeland grasshopper. That's also pictured on the bottom left. So pretty cryptic coloration until they take flight. Noisy flyers, kind of oxblood red hind wings, and these ones overwinter as mature nymphs. So you tend to see adults of these ones relatively earlier, or much earlier than you would see the pest species. These are just happy components of rangeland systems. They're happy to munch on native plants, and I've never heard of an instance where these have been economic pests. Another one pictured here, long antennae. That's a real good giveaway. If you see long antennae, that's not a grasshopper at all. That is, in fact, a meadow katydid. So that's the one that makes the long, sort of monotone trill in hayfields that you hear in the middle of the day. Very unusual for these to be economically damaging. I've heard some reports from the last year of very heavy populations in Manitoba, but I don't have a clear indication that these were economic. Typically, they can be numerous, but not typically damaging. So not a pest if it's got wings in the spring, not a pest if it's a noisy flyer, not a pest if it's got colored wings. So, talking about grasshopper populations and the weather, of course, a lot of discussion of this, especially with elevated temperatures, like we've seen in the past years. Um, Elevated temperatures favor these animals. They really like it warm. So, a warm spring contributes to early hatch, increase nymphal survival, increase fecundity. So that is, the more eggs a female will produce. So the warm weather contributes to survival, also contributes to population increase. You're going to see more rapid development of eggs, nymphs, and adults. These animals are ectotherms, so everything about them functionally is determined by temperature. You get a warm late summer and fall. Those are the conditions that are necessary for egg laying or oviposition. And that oviposition is going to be related to adult densities. Of course, boy needs to meet girl to contribute to the next generation. The timing of adult emergence, early in the case of 2023. So they had a lot of time to speed through their development, plus conditions were really favorable for them to speed through their development. And weather conditions, warm and dry, benefits them. So once again, that warm, dry conditions also promotes embryonic development. So their embryos inside those eggs are also ectotherms. They need to get to a certain level of embryonic development to overwinter well. So looking, we'll say at grasshopper mating and oviposition. From the happy couple on the top left, you can see a cartoon of oviposition. So that is, you can see her extending her abdomen into cracks in the soil, and she's going to use muscular strength and hydrostatic pressure to do that. And they get those eggs pretty deep, so they're pretty well protected. A picture lower right of a two-striped grasshopper actually ovipositing. And finally, you can see she's going to secrete a foam around the eggs, and that's going to harden, and it's going to have cement-like properties. It's quite hard. And these so they're well protected inside that egg case, underground, and in the case of a typical winter, they're also going to be protected by snow. So what's really important for oviposition is warm and dry, and these were the drought conditions August 31 of last year. So conditions look pretty favorable, especially in the southern portion of the province for grasshopper egg laying. And looking at this is climate normals, the grasshopper oviposition index. This is modeling that was developed by Ross Weiss. Ross has since retired with Ag Canada. And we're certainly going to miss his services. I'm certain that there will be an heir apparent to step up, and those that are working currently are doing an excellent job. So this is the oviposition index climate normals. You can see, southern part of the province, typically pretty favorable for egg laying. This is what things look like normally, quote unquote, normally. This is what things look like this past year. So highly favorable for grasshopper egg laying. It seems very likely, given the numbers of grasshoppers, opportunities for mating, population densities, that there are a lot of eggs in the soil. And we did have a pretty hard cold snap in a number of parts of the province without snow cover. I suspect, however, that given their relative cold hardiness, we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide, they're still going to do pretty well. Even if there is some mortality, I suspect we're still going to see pretty good numbers of grasshopper. So temperature, very important for grasshoppers. As I mentioned, warm, they really do like the warm temperatures for development of all life stages. They need to engage in what's called diapause before they can complete development. And that's how they get through winter. So those embryos developing in those eggs, in those egg cases, underground, typically underneath the snow, are going to stop development over the course of the winter. And this is, we'll say, a variation on the hibernation theme. It's arrested development, pretty strictly defined as diapause. So when you get to 30 degrees Celsius, the migratory and two-striped grasshoppers are going to reach their diapause ready stage in about 2 weeks. So they really speed through that embryonic development. They get to 80% development, which is pretty far advanced, and they're ready to overwinter. So if you consider that these eggs were going down pretty early, late June in some cases, to mid-July. They had a lot of time to get ready for winter, and were quite ready, and a lot of eggs went down. In the case of clearwing grasshopper, it diapauses early in its embryonic development. It's ready in about a week, but it's only 50% development, 50% developed. So this is why it's coming up later. So warm spring conditions are going to break diapause, and they're going to continue their embryonic development until they hatch. So just taking a look at these cartoon depictions of this, you can see the bottom third from right. This is as far as migratory grasshopper gets. You can see it's pretty far along. The top right, that's clear wing grasshopper. So it is. It hasn't gone through blastokinesis, hasn't gone through the acrobatics it goes through in the egg. At that point, it's not that well developed, so it still has a ways to go. It is actually possible to be too dry for grasshopper eggs. So there has to be some absorption of water by grasshopper eggs, and a minimum soil moisture of about 13.5% is necessary to complete development. That development is going to halt if that level of moisture isn't achieved, and it's going to stay in a stasis state until moisture increases, and they can stay that way for a while. In the case of two-striped grasshopper, they're actually going to die if they lose 2/3 of their moisture. That is the eggs. Clearing grasshopper, much like the other species, that moist soils are going to help with cold hardiness. Water, of course, is pretty temperature stable and can take a lot of energy before it changes temperature and then changes phase. So cold hardiness, migratory, significant egg mortality at -15. A consideration for that is that these are exposed eggs. So when you have a cover of snow underground inside the egg case, they're going to be pretty well protected, snug as a bug in a rug. And you can see that here just an example of the difference you can see with soil temperatures with and without snow. The more advanced the development, the hardier they are. So if they get to that diapausing stage, especially relatively early, they're going to be pretty tough over the winter. When you look at clearwing grasshopper, pardon me, the line didn't show up. If you look at the -23 line, it's pretty steady, much like the -12. So survivorship is lower, but they can take long periods of very cold temperatures. -29 seems to be a cutoff for these animals. And once again, these are eggs in ambient conditions without those protective factors. So fairly cold hardy. High temperatures can be really hard on nymphs. In the case of clearwing, very warm soil temperatures can cause difficulties in molting. So that nymph is going to hatch, and that period between molts is called an instar. I'm sure many of you have heard this term. So you get a molt, first instar, when it's or from the egg to the first molt is the first instar. From that first molt to the second molt to the second instar, etc. So they can actually get trapped in their exuvia, in their exoskeletons. That's obviously going to limit movement and be pretty limiting on survival when you get very warm, dry conditions. 50% nymph mortality possible for migratory grasshopper if you get consecutive very warm temperatures. Adults, however, pretty tough when it comes to heat. They can take very highly elevated temperatures for long periods of time and are happy to do so. Some will actually get their internal temperatures into the high 30s or low 40s through basking. So moisture, temperature, and disease. The grasshopper outbreaks in the 1930s, late 1940s, and 1961-ish, terminated by cool, hot, wet weather and outbreaks of Entomophora grillii. So that is a fungal pathogen. There are different isolates that can be more disease causing for different species of grasshoppers. So you can get side by side with very different species with very different effects from the same isolate of Entomophora grillii. There is a relatively moderate diversity of Entomophora grillii isolates described to date, but they are fungal pathogens of insects. And another name for this is summiting disease. So what it does when it infects a grasshopper, it obliges that animal to climb to the top of a plant and die. I mentioned the exoskeleton before. Think of it a little bit like a suit of armor, and it locks into place, and then the animal dies, and so that exoskeleton is still holding it in place. It's going to disintegrate inside and release fungal spores onto all of its brothers and sisters and friends. So good dispersal strategy for the fungus. Not so great if you're a grasshopper. But this is, of course, a clearwing grasshopper clinging to the part of top of a plant here that looks very much like it had died of entomoptera. Looking forward to the upcoming season, which of course we've mentioned in some detail, the impacts of temperature on grasshopper development and grasshopper survival. So these are probabilistic maps produced by Environment and Climate Change Canada, or specialists within that agency. This is for the period March, April, May. So we are looking at a relatively elevated likelihood of elevated temperatures for the upcoming 3 months. My experience with these maps is they tend to be pretty good. So and all of the predictions to date are indicating elevated temperatures for the upcoming year. Precipitation is a mixed bag. So consider this map to be a giant question mark for Saskatchewan, with some elevated probability of below normal directly in the center of the province. One thing that's probably very apparent to everyone in the province right now, this is the snow water equivalent. So that is the water trapped in snow, and this is what we can anticipate for March, April, May. Of course, a lot of the snow has melted in a number of parts of the province already, but this has been a consistent theme over the winter. Of course, we haven't seen a lot of snow in some parts of the province, which can be a little worrisome. Natural enemies, of course, affect grasshoppers much like they do a large number of other insects. These are just some of my favorites. They're not necessarily the most important for regulating grasshopper populations, but they are all interesting. There's scaleo species. These are scelionid parasitoids, just tiny little farts of bugs, and they attack the grasshopper eggs and will parasitize them there. Tangle vein fly are less common than, say, bee flies or some of the other natural enemies. They compensate for numbers with being really interesting. So what she's going to do is lay about 2,500 eggs on a fence post or another elevated structure or plant, and the wind is going to disperse those eggs. And when those eggs come in contact with a potential host like a grasshopper, they will parasitize that animal and feed on it. So it's an interesting dispersal strategy. Maybe not the most efficient. Might explain why they're not more prevalent than some of the other species, but there you go. And another interesting one is Formica sanguinea. These are slave-making ants. So they're relatively large ants for Saskatchewan, prone to biting, or at least biting me, and they will actually take slaves from other Formica species. So they'll capture developing pupa and eggs, haul them back to their own colonies, and put them to work as the lowest caste. They are generalist predators, so they will happily munch on grasshopper nymphs when they come in contact with them. Migratory behavior in grasshoppers can be very important, and the best studied of the 4 species that we have prevalent in the province currently as pests is the migratory grasshopper. So grasshoppers come pre-baked functionally, or migratory grasshopper come pre-baked for either short distance or long distance flying. And this is a heritable trait, and you're going to get conditions that are going to favor the heritability of that trait or the selection for that trait. So you get semi-arid conditions, patchy resource distribution. That's going to favor long distance flying. They are powerful flyers. They can fly to great heights, and they can fly for hours. So this work indicated that they could sustain flight longer than 10 hours, asterisks. And the reason for the asterisks is that they terminated the experiment after 10 hours. So they can fly for at least 10 hours at speeds of about 16 to 20 kilometers an hour. So you do the math, they're capable of 200 kilometers a day. They do typically like to fly upwind. So that's going to limit the distance, but we've got historic documentation of at least 100 kilometers per day, and they can do this in very large numbers. So there's no known upper limit for flight duration. However, 10 hours 10 hours is pretty substantial. And once again, they can reach heights where they are transported by wind current and become a problem for commercial planes with fouling windscreens. They are capable of flying at night, but typically they prefer to roost at night. So why is this important? And I mentioned before, this was the characterization or the description of long distance flights. This is an outbreak from the 1930s, and you can see in this case these animals had moved from their origins in the Dakotas well into Manitoba, well into Saskatchewan, and into southern Alberta, moving at sometimes 100 kilometers a day. They worked their way all the way down to Texas, these populations, and became very problematic there. So how does that affect us in the next year? This is the 2024 rangeland grasshopper hazard forecast from USDA APHIS. So you can see just below the 49th is a potential source of problematic animals, and we will be contacting our colleagues to see how their hatch is developing, how their populations are doing, and try to provide some early warning if we're anticipating a movement of grasshoppers into our part of the world. Though I think we're going to have substantial populations all on our own. So with that, we'll move on to wheat midge. We do a survey for it, and I'll present the results of the 2023 survey. The products that are available are limited, and they're limited to the active ingredient dimethoate. So that is Lagon or Saigon, and need to be applied when the adults are active. It doesn't have the ovicidal, so that is egg killing or larvicidal effects of chlorpyrifos, but chlorpyrifos is now off the table. There are varietal blends with the SM1 gene that are broadly available in a number of different varieties. So this really is a very good solution. They come as refuge in a bag. It really is very much a set it and forget it solution to wheat midge. Also pictured is Macrogleines penetrans, which can be a very important parasitoid of wheat midge populations. And from our survey, there was one population that was 67% parasitized. So they can be really important regulators of wheat midge populations. Looking at the 2023 survey, you can see that we still have hotspot in the Regina area, although numbers are diminished from previous years. You'll also notice too that the range of the survey didn't extend as far north as it has in previous years. We are reliant on permission-based access. So please, please, please indicate your willingness to participate in these surveys. Either contact me directly, or there is a QR code associated with our surveys. I believe I have it in my last slide, and you can just point your phone at that and a drop-down menu will appear. If not, contact me directly and we'll get you signed up for surveys, because yeah, once again, we need permission to access. So the risk is relatively diminished relative to previous years, but you can never count out wheat midge. If you get timely rain, so that is more than 25 millimeters before the end of May, you can get stimulation of those populations, and they can be very, very aggregated, so really clumped up. Even within an individual field, you could get real hot spots. So always good to monitor, especially you get those rains in May that stimulate their development. The next interesting one is Hessian fly. So the last report of this one was in 2014. We had multiple reports of this one in the Cut Knife, Blaine Lake, Bigger, and Central Butte area. As a rule, these are regulated by parasitoids, about 4 species, and we reared a eulophid, pictured lower left there, out of a Hessian fly pupa at the Crop Protection Lab. Tyler Wista with Ag Canada also reared a parasitoid from another sample. So the parasitoids are there, but we've seen an upregulation of Hessian fly populations. This can be a very damaging pest for cereals, and it's definitely one that we'll be keeping an eye out for. Another important cereal pest this past year was true armyworm, or also called armyworm cutworm. How many times can you say worm in one sentence? So we saw significant damage to wheat and durum in multiple locations, heaviest around Outlook in Saskatoon, and some of those fields were pretty heavily damaged. These are migratory insects and powerful flyers. Of course, not as caterpillars. Caterpillars are optimistic flyers, we'll say. As adults, they're medium-sized brown moths and relatively powerful flyers. So move up from the United States and find resources here to lay eggs on and develop. Another cereal pest that we had multiple reports for this year was cereal leaf beetle. You can see the damage there top right, in addition to a larva covered in what's called a fecal shield. So they cover themselves in their own feces to protect themselves from predators and parasitoids. So pretty good strategy if you don't want to have interactions. I'm not offering any social advice to anyone. I'm just saying. It seems to work reasonably well for them. However, they are really, really well controlled by a parasitoid. Uh, there is a Tarasica species that attacks them, and you can see that larva without the fecal shield. And those little flecks underneath the cuticle of that larva are actually wasp larvae developing inside of that beetle larva. So that beetle larva is done for. We did have evidence of parasitism from almost all sites, and this is really a good news story from a biological control perspective. The parasitoids do such a good job at controlling these populations that they are only rarely economically important and can be very well controlled by these parasitoids. Adult beetle pictured on the left. Wheat stem sawfly. We initiated a survey, a formal survey this year. We've been reliant on anecdotal evidence or anecdotal reports of wheat stem sawfly in Saskatchewan in recent years. So we've decided to initiate a formal survey, brought in a contractor to conduct this work, and sincere thanks to Sask Wheat and to SCIC for funding this study. What was detected was 86% cutting near Saskatchewan Crossing, another a field near Regina with heavy cutting. Cutting was relatively prevalent throughout the survey area, which concentrated on the south of the province. So this is one that we'll be continuing. We'll actually be looking a little bit farther north with this one as well, as we also had a report of heavy cutting reported in RM 438 near the Battlefords. And here's what the survey looked like. So yeah, you can see really heavy prevalence. A little bit further north than I was expecting, to be frank. And it is what it is. So yeah, we're going to continue to keep an eye out for that one. Of course, resistance is an excellent way. There are a number of resistant solid stem varieties that have demonstrated resistance or tolerance to the wheat stem sawfly. Durum is less susceptible than wheat, and there are a number of non-host crops that can be planted if you're in an area with heavy sawfly pressure. Flea beetles were a bit of a non-story in sorry, that should say 2023. Apologize for that. Less common. There were still significant populations of striped flea beetle in northeastern regions, and some reports of spraying, but they really seem to have evaporated from a number of different parts of the province. Some of the thinking on this is that they're less drought tolerant than crucifer flea beetle, which are the black ones, and so in cases of drought, then the crucifer flea beetle tends to become the dominant. For other reasons, likely associated with differences in their susceptibilities to insecticides. When things are wetter, striped flea beetle tends to dominate. Still working out all the nuts and bolts on that, but it's multiple factors certainly. Relatively lower populations, although we still saw some damaging populations in 2023. Including in the Moose Jaw area with crucifer flea beetle, and in the northeast with striped. And of course, large numbers of overwintering generation adult crucifer flea beetles feeding on canola pods. Some of the canola pods were pre-damaged by grasshoppers and crickets, So combined damage were pretty significantly damaging some pods and areas. No thresholds for late season flea beetles. Cabbage seed pod weevil was also sampled. This is an invasive species, a relatively recent addition to the biota of Saskatchewan. Populations were low overall, except for southwest, south central areas. Much of those regions were very dry, and there were some reports of spraying, although they were relatively uncommon, typically not at economic numbers this year. Results of the survey you can see here. So we did have some concentrated populations in the Swift area and in the Regina area. But relative to 2020, 20 and earlier into the late 20 teens, we've seen a real retraction of their populations. So they were really working their way north and working their way east, and in numbers, and those populations seem to have really retracted. A little uncertain as to why at this point. There are a number of factors that could contribute to this, and some of these are being examined by some excellent entomologists. They have found their way into Manitoba, albeit at low numbers. Aster leafhopper was also caught in large numbers. We dovetail this survey with our diamondback moth survey, and so yellow cards next to our pheromone traps for the diamondback moth, and populations were large, and infectivity with aster yellows was high. You can see the symptoms of aster yellows here in canola, that undifferentiated growth, and you're not going to get much of a yield out of that particular bunch. So the mean of infectivity was 16%, which is considerably higher than it was last year, and it was into the high 60s at one site. So high infectivity, exactly why uncertain. So the WIS lab at Agriculture Canada has developed a rapid LAMP test, and this will really speed processing of these samples. There are currently no thresholds for aster leafhopper in crops. Dimethylate is registered in canola, albeit not for this animal. Similarly or pardon me, malathion registered for canola, just not for leafhoppers. Although you could see some efficacy if you're controlling another pest as well. So diamondback moth, we continue to monitor with 63 trap sentinel system, and thanks to everyone who participates in this. It is greatly appreciated, and this work obviously couldn't continue without a lot of people pitching in. We do post the trap catches approximately weekly to the ministry website and the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. Like most years, we began to capture early May. Numbers increased until late June, and those populations continue to increase as generations, our new generations of diamondback moth are produced in the field. They don't overwinter here. They are migratory. They tend to work their way up from southern climates. So it can be, depending on which way the winds, from the Texas region as far east as Florida and northern Mexico, depending on where the winds are coming from and where they're blowing in. You can see this is an ATV that was driven through some canola and picked up a few diamondback moth larvae. So yeah, this was a pretty significant population. We did have some significant populations in this past year, and some accounts of spraying. However, no instances of apparent resistance to group 3 insecticide. We have had previous years where there was some indication of group 3 resistance. Happily, that wasn't the case this past year. If you do encounter a field, or your clients encounter a field where you're not getting the efficacy from a group 3 insecticide, please contact me and let me know. So looking at the survey, a bit misleading. Once again, they don't overwinter here. So this was the occurrence in Saskatchewan. This is not going to contribute to the generation next year's population. Once again, they need to fly in. Bertha armyworm, at low numbers. So yeah, very, very low numbers. They do tend to outbreak cyclically, and so we do continue to monitor for this one. It can be a devastating pest when it's numerous. Last minor outbreak about 2015, 2016. So yeah, we're due. So this is one we're going to continue to monitor for, and if numbers become become elevated, then of course we will put out a notification. Please keep an eye on the ministry website and the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network website for weekly trap updates. And looking at the survey, yeah, not a lot to write home about on this one. Populations were not very high at this point. So yeah, once again, we're going to continue to monitor for this one. Cutworms were a significant problem in some areas, with some areas, particularly in northern regions, with damage attributed to birth armyworm. These turned out to be clover cutworm and some other loopers being damaging in some other regions. For subterranean cutworms, most were redback. We also had some pale western cutworms. Some reports of spraying. Both of these species tend to like it dry, so dry conditions are going to contribute to their survival. And to potential damage. They really like uncultivated fields with broadleaf weeds, and the females are going to seek these out. If you got a nice diversity of plants, they got a relatively broad host range and will happily lay eggs on a number of different plant species, including weeds. Lygus, I guess some of the news for this, and this is news as of last year, the nominal threshold has been incorporated. We'll say broadly incorporated. We used to rely on an economic threshold that was based on commodity prices and control costs. Now we look at nominal threshold of 2 to 3 per sweep, late flower to early pod, full stop. That's at all commodity prices and control costs. Reason being, we don't want to get into a tolerance, non-tolerance for this animal. There's some evidence that canola can actually experience compensatory regrowth, so you can actually get a small yield bump with low levels of Lygus feeding, and we don't want to be wiping out natural enemies of this animal or any other animal by intolerance of low numbers of these at high commodity prices. So 2 to 3 per sweep, late flower to early pod. We had few reports of spraying in canola in 2023. However, we did get some reports of Lygus in yellow mustard in southern regions, both in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and a couple of really odd reports of Lygus in wheat that I don't have confirmation on, but from a reputable source. So I'll take that as valid. They can be very damaging to faba, and very low numbers can be damaging. And it's seeming the numbers are exceedingly low. So this may get into a tolerance, non-tolerance issue for them. It's more a quality issue, feeding on the seed and injecting their salivary enzyme, than for yield. This is a survey that was conducted by Teresa Cordero, master student of Sean Prager's at University of Saskatchewan, demonstrating relative prevalence and some of the species that were found in faba. Pea leaf weevil, this is going to be one of the last animals that we talk about. This is another invasive, relatively recent arrival in Saskatchewan as well. We continue to survey their populations, being invasive and rapidly spreading. This is another one too, where it's unlike cabbage seed boll weevil that was relatively more important a few years ago. Pea leaf weevil was relatively unimportant. We had a beautiful map of green with relatively low numbers almost everywhere. Things have changed in the last couple of years. It does continue to expand its range north and east, and populations increase substantially, especially in the north and northwest in particular. So taking a look at 2022, 2022 was a notable upregulation of populations. 2023, we pressed a little bit further north with our survey, and lo and behold, yeah, we found relatively large numbers of pea leaf weevil damage in those regions. So this work will continue. We may press a little bit further north again. So it all depends on what sort of resources we have available to us. This is the last insect that I'll talk about. This is spotted winged Drosophila. Once again, another invasive that was thought to not have the ability to establish well in Saskatchewan, given the cold winters here. It has established, and it's established relatively broadly. We don't have a large fruit industry here, but it is an important industry, and they are experiencing pressure from spotted wing Drosophila. It doesn't just attack commercial fruits either, so it will attack your pet cherry and your pet fruit trees in your yards. It is widespread. Populations are significant, and functionally, if the name of a host plant ends in berry, it's on the list for suitable for development for this animal, and will get attacked. You can see the reason the male there, the spotted wing. And on the right is the female. The female has a little saw-like ovipositor that she saws into healthy fruit. So Forrest Sharp, our provincial fruit specialist, has been leading the charge on this one, and currently using sentry traps to monitor these populations. So a bit of a curiosity here. We're looking at large numbers of females on the left, and then the males didn't show up till late in the year. The males are just as attracted to the traps as the females. What's happening here is uncertain, but widely distributed in numerous populations for spotted wing Drosophila. And finally, this is Richardson's ground squirrel. We conducted an online grower survey, got 174 responses from sites all across the province, so pretty good distribution of sites. We asked questions including acres affected, damage severity, control techniques, and satisfaction with the control. Plugging away on the model, this report is actually nearly finished. So some of the results of these were total acres affected by Richardson's ground squirrel. So certainly clustered, broadly distributed, and so they can be problematic in under warm, dry conditions as well, but working towards a model where we can get a little bit more predictive power. And with that, there's the QR code I promised, and I think I still have a tiny bit of time for questions.
Yes, awesome presentation. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
There is a few questions here. I'm going to start at the top. The first one I saw is, are there or do you have any information on how cattle grazing may affect the population of grasshoppers?
That is an excellent question that I don't have an answer for. Looking back historically, migratory grasshopper wasn't the dominant pest species, or two-stripe. It used to be an animal called Rocky Mountain locust, and that was the major pest. It outbroke, or there was an outbreak that was significant enough in 1874 that actually led to famine in North America. It was devastating, especially to growers in the Central Plains. So it's now extinct. So curiously enough, one of the factors that was thought to contribute to its extinction was the removal of bison from the landscape. So the coevolution, or the co-occurrence of these animals, the bison and the grasshoppers favoring, oviposition sites. I don't know that the minutia is very well understood, and it could be spurious correlation, but in short, that was a long way of saying I don't know.
Well, that kind of makes sense. There's a few more questions here on grasshoppers. Do grasshoppers take breaks during long flights?
Interesting question. Yeah, no, it doesn't seem they do. They'll rest at night. They'll roost at night. At least, with migratory grasshopper, with the long distance dispersers. So, once again, they're getting up, they're feeling the wind in their face, and they're flying into the wind, and will, can sustain that for hours. But yeah, are they stopping to rest? It seems likely, yeah, if they encounter resources that are suitable and attract them. Of course, they have excellent vision, and they smell very well with their antennae. So yeah, they're going to home in to host cues and opportunities.
And our tasty crops for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
In regards to hoppers again, when do we expect the fungus levels to grow enough in Southwest Saskatchewan to impact grasshopper populations based on past cycles?
Yeah, no, they don't cycle. I think that's a common misconception. So grasshopper populations and their diseases are not, adhering to hard cycles. So it's almost entirely dependent on the weather. So if we really need, cool, wet weather sustained to limit the development of grasshoppers and increase the opportunities for fungal pathogens to have their effect. So of course fungi really like things on the humid side. So I mean, until that happens, I don't think we're going to see regulation, by Entomophthora or Bovaria or some of the others, other fungi. There's some evidence that Entomophthora has a limited impact on grasshopper populations, although you do see spectacular sights on occasion, with entire fields covered with dead grasshoppers that have summited the plant. And I mean, you can smell them driving up a mile away.
Awesome.
Good, yeah,
Okay,
goodness.
just in regards to temperature and moisture, I'm going to throw in my own question.
Mhm,
You mentioned that uh, in dry conditions, the soil, eggs in the soil uh, development is halted.
mhm.
Considering how dry it's been, could those eggs, do they actually die or do they just kind of go dormant?
Uh, a little of both, little column A, little column B. They have a long evolutionary history in this part of the world, and of course, this part of the world has experienced severe droughts, um, and some much worse than we're experiencing currently. So they've worked through those. They'll work through whatever drought or increase as a response of dry conditions, but it takes very dry conditions to contribute to their mortality, and they're more likely to engage in what's called delayed diapause, where they're just gonna hunker down.
Okay. Um, I'm looking here at some other questions. Are there any additional effective biological control methods other than the one you already discussed in this presentation?
For grasshoppers, or
Yes,
for
I'm assuming, yeah, grasshopper.
they yeah, once again, they evolved in this part of the world. They have a boatload of natural enemies. I mean, there are so many things that eat grasshoppers. Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned before bee flies, in addition to the ones that I mentioned, a lot of vertebrate predators. So I mean, this time of year, you're going to see, the little birds of prey, the little harriers, hovering. They happily munch on large insects like grasshoppers. Ground squirrels happily munch on grasshoppers as well. So yeah, I guess you gotta weigh your options if your gophers are eating your hoppers, right? So then it's yeah, there are choices that need to be made. But no, I've on my place set up a lawn chair and maybe cracked a beer, and watched gophers munching away about 20 grasshoppers per hour, happily munching away.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
some
significant.
yeah, so some were better at catching them than others, but yeah, no, raccoons eat grasshoppers, weasels, a large number of vertebrates happily munch on grasshoppers, a number of invertebrates happily munch on grasshoppers. So they have a lot of natural enemies.
Potentially us too. I think they're serving them at U of S campus,
I,
maybe.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry you broke up there, or I didn't understand.
But potentially us too. We could be eating grasshoppers soon.
Oh yeah, yeah, not
Um,
not not really my taste, but I mean, but no, it's funny you say. I stumbled on an article called "A Grasshopper in Every Pot." And this was an English author documenting First Nations customs from the Plains people in the mid to late 1800s, and they were gathering grasshoppers in large numbers for food. So yeah, it wasn't bison for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So
yeah, yes. Okay, one here about pea leaf weevil. Do you believe that the pea leaf weevil populations are going to dramatically increase due to growers increasing amount of pulse acres on the prairies?
yeah, 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 A to B is a little difficult to predict. I mean, they're also subject to some climate factors, some weather factors. So I did a little modeling a little while ago, and found through that modeling that they were influenced by snow cover. So they're not as cold hardy as some other animals that evolved in this environment. Once again, they are invasive. So there seems to be a protective effect of that snow cover. So snow cover can have an upregulating effect on their populations, or at least preserve what's there. But yeah, more acres. I mean, that really is the $64,000 question, and not just for them. Yeah, do more acres make for more pests? It does seem likely, but yeah, hard data, a little hard to come by.
Okay. Um, are there any resistance issues developing with grasshoppers?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think grasshoppers have demonstrated resistance to any of the commercial products that we have available currently in Western Canada, and there are a lot. So I mean, of course, we've got diamides and synthetic pyrethroids and organophosphides and organic and carbamates. So there are a variety of different modes of action that can be used for grasshoppers, and should show. I don't think there is a heavy reliance on group 3 insecticides, and of course a lot of concern about lambda cyhalothrin uses being removed for feed crops. But with that in mind, there are other effective group 3s for nymph control, which is where you want to be using group 3s, and for mature nymph and adult control. There are 1Bs and 1A in addition to Coragen.
Okay. There's quite a few questions coming in. Give me 1 second here.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Considering the amount of beneficial parasitic insects that are out there, are there specific insecticides to stay away from?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Again, there are selective insecticides and there are non-selective. So when you're talking about malathion and dimethoate and the synthetic pyrethroids, the group 3s, desis and matador and pounce, etc. Those ones are really broad spectrum. I mean, they have a really significant effect on whatever insect they happen to whatever insect they happen to touch or be consumed by. This is one of the great strengths of the diamides. So like Coragen, because there are differences in the receptor site in different insect groups. So there was a divergence in evolution, and the ancestral state is different than some of the more derived states. So you got a lock, which is the insecticide, and you got a key, which is the receptor site. Insecticide, receptor site, key has to fit into lock. If there's a difference in that lock, that key associated with the insecticide doesn't fit anymore, and you don't get the effect. So if you're looking at grasshoppers and Lepidoptera, the key fits really well into that lock, and you get the neurotoxic effect. They're called ryanodine receptors. In the case of Hymenoptera, so ants and bees and wasps, as well as some other groups, um, there's enough difference in that receptor site where the key just doesn't fit very well, and so you don't get the toxicity. So that's why it's selective. So yeah, I think yeah, diamides are a real excellent step forward as far as selective. You can also make choices as far as when you apply insecticides, of course to preserve pollinators, and if you have large numbers of natural enemies in a field, you can opt to hold your fire and let the natural enemies do their work. I think aphids are a real good example of when it's pretty obvious when you should hold your fire. So if you have an aphid population, say pea aphid, and you monitor them consecutively over a few days, if you see that population holding steady or diminishing, the natural enemies, primarily parasitoids, are having a strong effect on that population, and there's nothing that you want to do in that case. So the natural enemies are doing the job. If that population is increasing, of course, then you want to consider spraying. So does that work for all insects? No, but in some cases it does. So that was a much longer answer than you probably anticipated,
Yeah, no, but very
or maybe,
informative.
or maybe you wanted. Yeah. So,
Yeah, thank you.
okay.
Well, we are at time, so there's some more questions on here, but I think are participants able to contact you directly or?
Yeah, absolutely. Just send me an email.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.